Paris, 1905. The stage lights dim. A hush falls over the Musée Guimet. The audience, dressed in their finest evening attire, leans forward in anticipation. They have come to witness something extraordinary, something the city has never seen before. And then she appears. A woman emerges through curtains of silk, her body wrapped in translucent veils that shimmer like water under moonlight. Her movements are slow, deliberate, hypnotic. She raises her arms toward an invisible sun, her fingers tracing ancient symbols in the air. The audience is transfixed. They believe they are witnessing something sacred, something from the temples of Java, a ritual dance from the mysterious East. But what they don't know is that the woman before them, the woman they will soon call Mata Hari, was born thousands of miles from any Eastern temple. Her real name is Margaretha Geertruida Zell, and she is Dutch. 20 years earlier, in the provincial town of Leeuwarden, the Netherlands, young Margaretha lived in a world of broken dreams. Her father, a successful hat merchant, lost everything in failed business ventures. The family that once enjoyed comfort now faced humiliation and poverty. Her mother died when she was 15. Her father abandoned the family shortly after. Margaretha, suddenly alone, was sent away to train as a kindergarten teacher. But scandal followed her even there. Whispers of an inappropriate relationship with the headmaster, forcing her to flee once again. At 18, desperate for escape, she answered a newspaper advertisement. A Dutch colonial officer named Rudolf MacLeod sought a wife. She sent her photograph. He was captivated. They married within months. It was a catastrophic mistake. Rudolf was 20 years older, an alcoholic, violent, cruel. He brought her to the Dutch East Indies, to Java, where his military posting stationed them in a world of stifling colonial society. Margaretha tried to play the role of dutiful wife, but Rudolf's jealousy was pathological. He accused her of infidelity, beat her, paraded his own mistresses before her eyes. They had 2 children. Their son died mysteriously at age 2, possibly poisoned, possibly a victim of his father's neglect. The grief nearly destroyed her. When they returned to the Netherlands, Margaretha knew she could not survive this life. She took her daughter and left, but Rudolf, using his military connections, fought back. He won custody. He cut off all financial support. He even prevented her from seeing her child. Margaretha Zell had nothing, no money, no family, no prospects. Society saw her as a failed wife, a woman with no value. She was 28 years old, and her life appeared to be over. But she refused to disappear. She traveled to Paris with a single advantage. She had lived in Java, she had seen the temples, watched the dances, absorbed the aesthetics of a culture that fascinated Europe's elite, and she understood something crucial about her moment in history. Europe was obsessed with the exotic, hungry for the mysterious Orient. They wanted spectacle, fantasy, escape from their rigid Victorian morality. So she gave them a goddess. She invented a new identity completely. She became Mata Hari, Malay for Eye of the Day, the sun itself. She claimed to be a sacred dancer from a Javanese temple, trained since childhood in ancient erotic rituals. She spoke of her supposed Hindu mother and British father. Every word was fiction, but it was fiction her audience desperately wanted to believe. And on that night in 1905, when she removed her veils one by one before Paris's cultural elite, Margaretha Zell ceased to exist. Mata Hari was born. What she didn't realize was that the myth she created would eventually destroy her. Within months, Mata Hari became the sensation of Paris. Her performances at private salons and exclusive theaters drew aristocrats, artists, millionaires, and military officers. She danced in mansions, in grand hotels, in opera houses across Europe, Berlin, Vienna, Monte Carlo, Milan. Everywhere she went, men fell at her feet. But Mata Hari was more than a dancer. She understood that her body was currency in a world where women had few paths to power. She became a courtesan, carefully selecting lovers from the highest ranks of European society. German industrialists, French ministers, Russian Grand Dukes, Spanish diplomats. Each affair brought gifts, jewels, furs, cash, properties. She lived in luxury hotels, wore couture gowns, traveled in first-class rail compartments. The men who desired her competed for her attention. A German banker in Berlin showered her with emeralds. A French cavalry officer bought her a villa. A Dutch baron paid her debts without question. She played them against each other with calculated charm, never committing to anyone, always maintaining her independence. For a woman who had once been powerless, this was intoxicating. She moved through Europe's elite circles with remarkable ease, attending state dinners, military galas, diplomatic receptions. In Berlin, she danced for Kaiser Wilhelm's officers. In Paris, she entertained generals from the French High Command. She spoke multiple languages, told captivating stories about her invented past, and possessed an intelligence that many underestimated. Men confided in her. They spoke freely in her presence, believing her to be merely decorative, forgetting that beautiful women also have ears. But the world around her was changing dangerously. By 1914, tensions between European powers had reached a breaking point. Alliances were fracturing, military build-ups accelerated, nationalism turned violent. And then, in June, an assassination in Sarajevo ignited the powder keg. The Great War began. Suddenly, the borders Mata Hari crossed so freely became battle lines. The men she entertained in Berlin and Paris were now enemies, dedicated to destroying each other. Her lifestyle, once seen as glamorous, now appeared suspicious. How could one woman maintain relationships with officers on both sides of a brutal conflict? The German intelligence service noticed her access first. They saw opportunity. An agent named Karl Kromer approached her in 1915 with a proposition. She could continue her lavish lifestyle, receive substantial payments, and all they needed in return was information. Small things, conversations she overheard, names of officers she met, troop movements mentioned casually over champagne. She needed the money. The war had disrupted her income streams, closed theaters, sent her wealthy lovers to the front lines. The Germans offered 20,000 francs immediately. She accepted, receiving the designation H-21. But Mata Hari made a fatal miscalculation. She believed she could control the situation, that she could take German money without truly betraying anyone. She thought herself clever enough to navigate between two worlds at war, neutral like her native Holland, above the conflict that was consuming millions of lives. She didn't understand that in wartime there is no neutrality. There is no space between sides. And the game she thought she was playing had rules far more deadly than she imagined. The seductress had become a pawn. And pawns, in the end, are always sacrificed. Mata Hari convinced herself she could serve both sides and emerge unscathed. After all, she had spent years manipulating powerful men, playing them against each other for her benefit. Why would espionage be any different? She would take money from the Germans, share trivial information, and maintain her lifestyle. Simple, but nothing about war is simple. In 1916, while traveling through The Hague, she met Captain Vadim Maslov, a Russian pilot serving with the French forces. He was 21 years old, handsome, idealistic, genuinely in love with her. For the first time in years, Mata Hari felt something beyond calculation. She fell deeply for this young man who saw her not as an exotic fantasy, but as a woman. He became her weakness, the crack in her armor of self-interest. When Maslov was shot down and severely wounded, transferred to a military hospital near Paris, Mata Hari became desperate. She needed money for bribes to see him, resources to ensure his proper treatment, influence to keep him from being sent back to combat. Her German payments had been irregular, insufficient. She needed more. She made a decision that sealed her fate. She approached Captain Georges Ladoux, head of French counter-espionage, and offered her services. She claimed she could seduce German officers, extract military secrets, spy for France. Ladoux was immediately suspicious. He knew about her German connections, her travel patterns, her relationships with enemy officers. But he saw an opportunity. He gave her a mission to Madrid, ostensibly to gather intelligence, but really to observe her, to confirm his suspicions. Mata Hari traveled to Spain, believing she was working for France. In Madrid, she reconnected with German contacts, including the military attaché Arnold Kaller. She flirted, she gathered minor information, she played her role. What she didn't know was that Kala suspected she had turned, that he was deliberately feeding her false information. And he communicated about her using a code the Germans knew the French had broken. The messages were intercepted immediately. French intelligence read every word. Communications mentioned Agent H-21, described her movements, referenced payments. The trap was closing, constructed by both sides, with Mata Hari caught in the center. She returned to Paris in January 1917, confident she had served France well, expecting payment and gratitude. Instead, she found herself under constant surveillance. Her hotel rooms were searched, her letters were opened, her bank accounts were frozen. Men in dark coats followed her through the streets. She didn't realize that France was losing the war badly. Massive casualties, failed offensives, mutinies spreading through the ranks, civilian morale collapsing. The government needed scapegoats, explanations for their disasters that didn't involve admitting their own incompetence. They needed traitors to blame. And Mata Hari, the foreign woman who had slept with generals, who had crossed borders freely, who fit every prejudice about female sexuality and betrayal, was perfect. On February 13th, police arrived at her hotel. They arrested her without ceremony, without explanation. She protested, demanded lawyers, insisted on her innocence. They ignored her completely. As they led her away in handcuffs, Mata Hari still believed this was a misunderstanding she could resolve with charm and words. She still thought she controlled the narrative. She was catastrophically wrong. The cell in Saint-Lazare prison was cold, damp, designed to break spirits. Mata Hari, accustomed to silk sheets and champagne breakfasts, now slept on a thin mattress crawling with lice. The woman who had commanded the attention of emperors now shared space with prostitutes and thieves, but she maintained her composure. Convinced this nightmare would end soon, it didn't. Captain Ledoux built his case methodically. French intelligence presented the intercepted German communications mentioning Agent H-21. They compiled lists of her lovers, all men with access to military secrets. They documented her bank deposits, her luxury purchases, her border crossings. They transformed every aspect of her life into evidence of guilt. But there was a problem. They had no concrete proof, no stolen documents in her possession, no decoded messages in her handwriting, no witness who had seen her pass actual intelligence. Everything was circumstantial, based on suspicion and inference. In peacetime, the case would have been laughed out of court. But this wasn't peacetime. France was bleeding. The Nivelle offensive had failed catastrophically, resulting in over 100,000 French casualties in days. Entire regiments were refusing orders, singing revolutionary songs, some even marching toward Paris. The government was terrified of complete collapse. They needed to show the public that they were fighting enemies within, that defeats weren't due to incompetent generals, but to treacherous spies. Mata Hari's interrogations grew harsher. Ledoux and his men questioned her for hours, repeating the same accusations, twisting her words, wearing down her defenses. She admitted taking money from the Germans, but insisted she had given them nothing valuable. She confessed to approaching French intelligence, but claimed she wanted to serve France. Every explanation, no matter how truthful, sounded like a lie under their hostile examination. Meanwhile, the Germans abandoned her completely. They denied ever recruiting her, destroyed records of their contact, erased her existence from their files. She was now useful to them only as a distraction, a name the Allies could chase while real agents continued their work undetected. The French did the same calculation. Whether Mata Hari was actually a dangerous spy was irrelevant. What mattered was that she could be presented as one. Her exotic persona, her sexual history, her foreign origin, all of it made her the perfect scapegoat. The press, heavily censored and desperate for stories that didn't involve French defeats, seized on her case with savage enthusiasm. Newspapers called her the greatest spy of the century. They claimed she had caused the deaths of 50,000 French soldiers. They published lurid illustrations showing her seducing generals while stealing documents. None of it was verified, but none of it needed to be. The public, traumatized by years of war, hungry for someone to blame, believed every word. In her cell, Mata Hari wrote desperate letters to friends, to former lovers, to anyone who might help. Most went unanswered. The few who responded claimed they barely knew her. Power protects itself, and she had become toxic. She finally understood the truth. She wasn't being prosecuted for what she had done. She was being sacrificed for what France needed her to be. The trial was merely a formality, July 24, 1917. The military tribunal convened in a windowless chamber at the Palais de Justice. 3 judges, 7 military officers, all men hardened by years of war. They sat behind a long table, their faces expressionless. Their verdict likely decided before Mata Hari even entered the room. She arrived wearing an elegant blue suit with a feathered hat, determined to maintain dignity even as they destroyed her. She understood spectacle, understood that appearances mattered. If she was to be judged, she would be judged as herself, not as some cowering prisoner. The prosecutor, Lieutenant André Mornay, rose with theatrical fury. He painted Mata Hari not as a human being, but as a monster, a demon in female form who had weaponized sexuality to destroy France. His voice trembled with manufactured rage as he accused her of being responsible for the deaths of tens of thousands of our soldiers. He presented the intercepted German communications. He listed her wealthy lovers. He detailed her bank accounts. He described her travels across enemy lines. But nowhere in his presentation was there actual evidence of espionage. No codes, no documents, no testimony from anyone who had seen her transmit intelligence. Just circumstance, innuendo, and prejudice. Her lawyer, Edouard Clunet, was 74 years old, a former lover who still cared for her but was hopelessly outmatched. He argued that the German messages could be fabrications, that her relationships were personal, not professional, that taking money wasn't the same as committing treason. His voice was tired, unconvincing even to himself. The court refused to hear witnesses for the defense. They denied her request to call military officers who could testify to her character. They rejected evidence showing the Germans themselves considered her information worthless. The proceedings were less a trial than a public execution disguised as justice. Mata Hari took the stand in her own defense. She spoke clearly, without tears or hysteria. Yes, she had taken German money in 1915, but she gave them nothing of value. Yes, she had offered to spy for France, motivated by her love for Vadim Maslov and her desire to serve the country that had given her a second life. Yes, she had been naive, perhaps foolish, but she was not a traitor. The judges stared at her with cold contempt. To them, she represented everything wrong with modern women: independent, sexual, uncontrolled by father or husband. She had lived freely, loved freely, profited from her beauty. In their minds, such a woman was inherently dangerous, inherently guilty. Mornay delivered his closing argument with biblical fury. He called her a plague and he a poison. He declared that her beauty itself was a weapon against France. He demanded death. The deliberation lasted less than an hour. When the judges returned, their senior officer read the verdict in a flat, bureaucratic tone. Guilty of espionage, guilty of intelligence with the enemy, guilty of causing military disasters. Sentence: death by firing squad. Mata Hari sat motionless, her face pale but composed. She had performed on stages across Europe, invented an entire identity from nothing, survived poverty and abuse and loss. But she could not survive being a woman in a world at war. Justice had never been the point. The cell in Saint-Lazare became her entire world. 41 years old, Mata Hari spent her final months writing letters that would never reach their destinations. She wrote to Vadim Maslov, pouring out her love, begging him to remember her kindly. She never learned that he had already forgotten her, moved on, refused to acknowledge their relationship when questioned. Love, like power, evaporates when it becomes inconvenient. She wrote to her daughter, now a young woman she hadn't seen in years, trying to explain the unexplainable. How do you tell your child that the world has decided you must die? That letter was confiscated, destroyed, deemed too dangerous to deliver. Her appeals were rejected mechanically. The military court saw no reason to reconsider. The government needed her execution to proceed as planned. The war was going badly. American troops hadn't yet arrived in sufficient numbers, and the French public needed to believe their leaders were taking action against invisible enemies within. October 15th, 1917. Dawn had not yet broken when the guards came for her. She had been moved to a smaller cell in preparation, closer to where the sentence would be carried out. She dressed carefully in a tailored suit, dark and elegant, applied makeup with steady hands. If she was to die, she would die as Mata Hari, not as frightened Margaretha Zell. The prison chaplain arrived, offering final prayers. She declined. She had never been religious, saw no reason to pretend otherwise now. Some witnesses later claimed she was hysterical, collapsed, had to be carried. They were lying. Every reliable account confirms she walked steadily, spoke calmly, maintained absolute composure. They transported her to the Vincennes military barracks in the cold pre-dawn darkness. A firing squad of 12 soldiers waited, young men who had been told they were executing the woman responsible for their comrades' deaths. Most of them probably half believed it. Military officials stood at attention. A small group of journalists had been permitted to witness, ensure the execution was reported correctly. Everyone waited in uncomfortable silence as Mata Hari was led to a wooden post in the middle of the courtyard. The officer in charge offered her a blindfold. She refused it. She wanted to see the men who would kill her, wanted them to see her face as they pulled their triggers. Some accounts say she smiled, others claim she blew a kiss to the firing squad. The truth is probably simpler. She stood straight, looked directly at them, and waited. They offered to bind her hands. Again she refused. She would not be tied like an animal. The officer raised his sword. The soldiers lifted their rifles. In that final moment, as dawn light began breaking over Paris, Mata Hari supposedly spoke her last words. "I am prepared." The sword fell. 12 rifles fired as one. The sound echoed across the empty courtyard like thunder. She fell immediately, her body crumpling to the ground. The officer approached, drew his revolver, and fired a final shot into her head to ensure death. It was procedure, mechanical, without malice or mercy. Mata Hari, born Margaretha Zell, died at 41. No one claimed her body. She was buried in an unmarked grave, her remains later used for medical study. The myth, however, was just beginning. The newspapers screamed their headlines within hours. "The greatest spy in history executed. Mata Hari pays ultimate price for treason. Seductress of death finally silenced." The stories were sensational, lurid, packed with fabricated details. France celebrated. The government claimed victory against espionage. The public felt satisfied that justice had been served. But something strange happened in the years that followed. Questions began to emerge. Historians examining the case in the 1920s found troubling gaps. Where was the evidence? What specific intelligence had she actually transmitted? Which military operations had she compromised? The answers were always vague, circular, unsatisfying. The intercepted German messages were suspiciously convenient, possibly deliberate disinformation. Her supposed victims, the 50,000 dead soldiers, were never identified or connected to any specific breach. By the 1930s, former intelligence officers began speaking more freely. A German spymaster admitted in his memoirs that Mata Hari had been utterly worthless as an agent. A French official confessed privately that her execution had been politically necessary rather than legally justified. The truth was emerging slowly, like a body rising from deep water. She had been a scapegoat, a convenient target for a nation desperate to explain its failures. France wasn't losing because of incompetent generals or impossible strategies. France was losing because of exotic seductresses corrupting virtuous men. It was a comfortable lie, and Mata Hari had paid for that comfort with her life. The legend grew in unexpected directions. Books portrayed her as a master spy, a femme fatale of unprecedented cunning. Films depicted her as tragic and romantic, doomed by love and circumstance. She became a symbol, endlessly reinterpreted, the dangerous woman, the liberated woman, the victimized woman. Everyone projected their own meanings onto her death. Decades passed. Archives opened. Scholars gained access to classified documents from both French and German intelligence services. The verdict became increasingly clear. Mata Hari had likely passed no significant intelligence to anyone. She had taken money, certainly. She had been reckless and naive, absolutely. but she had not been the master spy of legend. She had been something far more threatening to the world of 1917, a woman who refused to be controlled. In 2017, exactly 1 century after her execution, the French government finally released the complete file on her case. Researchers confirmed what many had long suspected. The evidence was manufactured. The trial was predetermined. The execution was theater. Mata Hari had been killed not for what she did, but for what she represented. Today, her image appears in museums, in exhibitions about World War I, in feminist retrospectives about women who defied convention. Historians debate her endlessly. Was she a victim or an opportunist? A symbol of misogyny or simply someone who made catastrophic choices? Perhaps she was all of these things simultaneously, too complex to fit comfortably into any single narrative. In the Fries Museum in her native Leeuwarden, a permanent exhibition tells her story. Visitors see her costumes, her photographs, her letters. They read about Margaretha Zell, the girl from a broken family who reinvented herself completely. They learn about Mata Hari, the dancer who captivated Europe, and they confront the truth about her death. A single rose often appears at the base of her portrait, left anonymously by visitors who recognize something in her story that still resonates today. Perhaps the greatest sin of Mata Hari was being too free for a world at war, too alive for men who needed someone dead. The woman was destroyed, but the myth endures, immortal and undefeated.